Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Maliga Young Park dotting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. How's everybody doing out there? Okay, so I did go back in time quite a while. I went to 2012. So I have a game between Roderick Nava, as you guys know, and Giovanni Mejia, both from the Philippines. So it's of course it's a Philippines grand final. So people from the Philippines. What I wanted to do, I went searching on the internet. And I was trying to see, because there are a lot of Asian cultures who have gestures. I mean, in India, you know, you have the namaskar, and Thai cultures. I mean, it's a similar sawatdi. It's a similar type of gesture. So I was looking to try to see if I could find any type of gestures that people have from the Philippines. So I did find a gesture. It is going to be kind of hard for me to do it myself. And I'm not sure anybody who's watching my stuff who might be considerably older than me. I'm 35 myself, so I think it'd have to be somebody in their 70s or 80s that I would have to be doing this to. But I did come across something called Mano Po. And so basically, this is me learning it, so I'm clearly not telling you guys about it. But, you know, you take your right hand with somebody who's much older than you, and you press it to your forehead, and that is the Mano Po. You're just asking for a blessing. So for anybody who would like to receive it, or who just feels like they're so much older than me, I will Mano Po to you. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Of course, for all my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking makaibigan? Masaya akong makita kang muli. Meron am I spacing on this? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. I paused on it for a second. Magandang umaga, magandang apon, magandang araw, magandang gabi. Appreciate you guys very much. Almasal tayo. It's super morning time for you guys, so appreciate everybody very much for stopping by. So I have talked enough, but I just wanted to kind of tell you guys that I found that gesture. So let me know. Give me some feedback on it. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we have d4, d5. Knight comes to f3. We see knight to f6. We got c4, and then we have pawn takes c4. So we did it in a little bit longer way, but we did come across the Queen's Gambit accepted. And then so we see e3. We have e6. Bishop takes c4. We have c5. Castles by white. a6. And a6 is a pretty clear intention. I mean, we're trying to push b5. So sometimes you'll see people go a4. It's not really the best in this position to go a4, but a lot of times you'll see a4 played just to prevent b5. But we do see knight to b5, and then we have b5 now. And so we choose to go back to b3. We want to have some influence on this diagonal. It was always the preferred diagonal of Bobby Fischer. So bishop comes to b7. We have e4. Before we get into pawn takes d4, which is what we saw in the game, you're not really worried about b4 because you're thinking like, man, you're just knocking this knight away from covering this pawn, and you have a lot of fire on it. You would actually be seeing bishop to a4 with check, that kind of throws black off just a little bit. You would see bishop to c6, and then knight would be coming to e5. And it's actually very hard to protect this position as black. It's not like it's just overwhelmingly winning for white, but this is a very nice position. And you are, sacrificing your knight, but I mean, you have a lot of pressure going on up here. So backing up, like I said, we did see pawn takes d4, and then we have knight takes d4. And we have actually reached a position that if you do want to pause the video and see what black plays here, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So, some of you guys might be wondering, okay, like this position is not crazy open, right? This pawn is like severely underdefended. So even if I captures and stuff and I get a rook to e1, I don't really have a lot to worry about. Well, unfortunately, the position as it sits right now, you have a lot to worry about. if that's your thoughts. Now, knight to c6 is the move that I was looking for in the game, and it's not like automatically the only move to play in the position. I mean, there's h5s, there's bishop to c5s. There are a lot of different moves you can play in the position, but the thing that you have to be paying attention to. So I mean, basically, if you pick knight to c6, bishop to c5, h5, I mean, all of those things would work very well. But you just absolutely cannot take this pawn. The thing that I'm going to tell you guys about the situation is, I mean, it's not like it's always a situation, but you have to make sure that you double, triple check and make sure that you're being very aware of, going into like capture mode with your king still stuck in the center. White has their king already tucked away. So rook to e1, you really have to look into the future and see if rook to e1 is a very, very real threat. So, unfortunately, if you did pick knight takes e4 in this position, thinking just, hey, man, I'm going to win me a pawn, and I'm going to kind of dip in and get out of the way, because, there's not a lot of pressure on this king. There actually is a lot. You do kind of have to see a little bit far, though, so giving it to you a little bit. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and then you have rook to e1. And it kind of seems like bishop to d5 is just taking care of the situation. But there is too much firepower going on. And there's a very unique feature in this particular position. Bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, and then you have knight takes e6. And of course, you don't want to go back with your queen and take care because you're just going to be losing your queen. So that's not good. But if you actually take the queen on d1, so that's why I said it takes a... I mean, this is like, what is this, like 5 moves deep that you have to be calculating? The problem is in this particular position, and this is a very unique feature to the position, and this is surely something that Roderick Nava was looking at for him to go into this variation, is actually knight to g7 check. And the problem with knight to g7 check is it is a double check. So you can't only worry about this knight and you can't only worry about this rook because you are being double checked. So the only way to parry a double check is to move the king. The only 2 squares to move is to move it on the line where the queen is. So after king comes to d8, you see rook to d1 with check. And then after the king goes to c8, you've actually managed to escape your knight back to f5 and you've grabbed a pawn. So all things being equal, you've grabbed a pawn. Now, this is 7 moves deep in the situation. So this is definitely takes a lot of calculation for both sides to be figuring out. So I might have gone into this myself. So don't feel bad if you did choose knight takes e4. It seems like a very legitimate capture. It doesn't seem like there's that much danger going on, but there is. So going back, like I said, knight took on d4. We saw knight to c6. Now we're getting into a situation where the position isn't as bad. So bishop covers on e3. We see bishop to e7. Knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and then we have f3. So now that we've moved this bishop in a way, so one of the things you want to be thinking about, when you're thinking about like possibly capturing in the center, opening up the position, a lot of the times bishop to e7 is like a really, really nice covering move. And it basically like makes all of these different, tactics and stuff just like non-existent. So we do have castles by black. And then we see the novelty of the game, which is queen to e1. As of 2012, queen to e1 is the novelty. You're basically just giving yourself the option of kind of getting onto this diagonal here, maybe putting your queen here, maybe redirecting the bishop, swinging a rook over and stuff like that, getting your bishop down, trying to add some, firepower on the king side and stuff like that. So it's a very logical move. Rook comes to c8. We see rook to c1. Queen comes to d6. And we see knight down to e2. Bishop comes back to b7, and then we see rook to d1. And, we're just kind of thinking, why not attack the queen? It's almost always legit to attack a queen or a king with a bishop or a rook or something like that because you usually force it to move. Queen comes to b4. We see queen takes b4, bishop takes b4. We see a3. We have bishop up to c5, and then we have king to f2. And so, the thing about the position now is since we've traded the queens, we're getting more towards an endgame. So, we are looking at, moving our king more into the center of the board. So, the fight when you get into the endgame, as you guys probably know, is, getting your king better positioned trying to outflank and you know, oppose the opponent's king, and just try to like push yourself into the other side of the board. So we see rook f to e8. We got h3. King comes to f8. We see knight to f4. King comes down to e7. So, I mean, these moves would look kind of weird if there were queens on the board, but because the queens are off the board, there are a lot less tactics. So the kings kind of wandering into the center aren't that bad. We see g4. We got a5. A rook to c1. Bishop takes e3. King takes e3. So as you guys can see, I mean, it's still fairly equal. But, I mean, this king is doing slightly better than this king. And it would actually be kind of dangerous for either king to try to step onto the d file because a rook can definitely come and attack you. So knight comes back to d7. We see knight down to e2. So we're going to see a lot of maneuvering coming up here. Knight comes to c5. It's just basically each side trying to like maximize their pieces. And so this is a really nice move for the knight because you are attacking this undefended bishop on b3. The bishop comes back to a2. And, you know, with possibilities of redirecting it over. And after we see b4, this bishop doesn't really want to get closed out of the game. So we actually see pawn takes b4, and then bishop to c4. And we're thinking about pushing b3 and kind of cementing that bishop on that square. Rook e comes to d8. We see knight to d4. Bishop comes back to a8. We got b3. Like I said before, now the bishop and the knight are both, you know, protecting that square. So this is a really nice little anchor point for the bishop. We got g6. Knight comes down to e2. We see bishop back to b7. And then we see rook to a1. You know, things are still fairly equal. I mean, there's not really, you know, either side isn't really doing like, you know, much better than the other side. It's, you know, basically either person's game. So we see rook over to a8. And this actually starts to give white the possibility of getting into black's position. Knight comes up to d4. We see rook d to c8. Rook takes a8. Bishop takes a8. And then we see rook to a1. And as you guys can see, there is, you know, there's a little bit of a problem for black in this position. It's the fact that they can't really move their rook down. You know, you'd like to try to like defend against this check on a7. But the bishop is going to be hanging. So yeah, black has kind of created a little bit of a problem for themselves. So bishop comes down to c6. We see rook to a7. And, you know, we start to see that white is starting to infiltrate black's position. So, you know, taking a few things into consideration, this king is doing a little bit better than this king. It's a little bit further advanced. And now we have penetration by this rook on the 7th rank. And so, you know, we have, you know, we have a lot going on for white in the position, a little bit more than black. And we also have the ability to move in the knight down and trying to attack this this pawn. It's going to be kind of hard to defend this pawn. So we have bishop back to d7. We got f4. We see f6. We got e5. We see f5. Pawn takes f5. Pawn takes f5. We see king over to f3. We have h6. And so the king is like, hey, man, I'm going to go ahead and try to like start shooting over to this side of the board and attacking this undefended pawn. So the king comes back to f8. King goes to h4. We see rook over to d8. Rook comes to c7, attacking the knight. So we can't really have that. So we see rook to c8. Rook takes c8. Bishop takes c8. And then we do have now knight down to c2, attacking this lonely pawn. You know, black is prepared to meet king to h5 with king to g7, protecting this pawn. But, you know, you definitely have some points of interest for white in this position. I mean, you have this pawn that really has to be defended. So you don't really have a lot of movability with your pieces. Knight comes down to e4. We see knight takes b4 now. Like something had to give. Either it was going to give now or a little bit later. Knight comes down to d2. We see king to g3. King down to e7. We see knight to c6 with check. King comes to d7. We see knight down to d4. And this is a really nice like retreating move because now we're giving our bishop some movability because now this knight is going to be holding this pawn. King comes over to e7. We see king down to f2. We see bishop to d7. And then we actually see bishop to d3. And it is in this position that Mejia does resign the game. And the position might look kind of bad for black because it looks like this knight can't go anywhere. You know, you can't go here, can't go here because of the bishop. Definitely can't go there because of the bishop and the pawn. The knight is holding this square. The king is holding this square. So the only retreating move for black is actually knight to e4 with check. but this unfortunately leaves a pawn in a very, very vulnerable position. After bishop takes e4, pawn takes e4, you see king up to e3. You know, there isn't a way to defend this pawn. So now you're going to be in a position where, yes, you do have a bishop, but your opponent has 2 extra pawns than you do. And like I said, the bishop cannot come here. So this king is going to be taking this pawn next move. So for example, bishop comes back to c8. King comes to e4. Bishop comes to b7 with check. And then king comes down to d3. And after king comes to d7, b4 is coming. And the major problem that black has in the position is that this knight is sitting on a dark square, so it can never be contested. And it is just permanently trained on this pawn. So either the king or the bishop has to like link itself to this pawn to make sure that it's not captured. And so this just allows, this ties down black, and it allows white to just kind of start, you know, getting into the position. You know, the king is going to be able to start kind of coming up here like this. You definitely can't check immediately because you're going to be looking at b4 getting pushed. You know, the king is going to be just like stepping up into this square. And he's just going to just forever be able to just continue to just improve his position. And this pawn is going to be almost unstoppable going to b8. So in light of all of those things, back in this position here, after king came down to f2, bishop came to d7, and bishop came to d3. Seeing that, this is the point that he resigned the game. So it was a pretty nice game. Pretty nice to play game. Pretty straightforward. It was pretty even for like a little while in the middle there, but you know, it kind of ended up being you know, just that little bit extra with that rook to a8 exchange. And so that is all she wrote. So I'm gonna go ahead and get these good mornings for all of my different people in the Philippines. So maayong buntag, mayad na agahan, naibeg na bigat, masantos ya kabason, mahi na aga, buenos dias, maayong aga, mapian na uma, kapian kapuno dios, mayapa abak, mayad na aga, mapia agay, mapia kapa pizza, my big abukla, marjana buntag, marya may nat, malpe na aga, kasan yangan CLB, salam, assalamu alaikum, and mercy to you. Appreciate you guys very much for coming by. Maraming salamat, aking makaibigan, paalam, and I will see you guys next time. Or makito tayo mamaya and paalam.